Representative Omar, before this committee votes on your recommendations for increased aid to Somalia, I think the members should know about the $340,000 you've personally wired to Mogadishu over the past 4 years, and specifically who received that money. The words, sharp and unyielding as a guillotine blade, sliced through the hushed, stagnant air of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing room. It was a space usually defined by polite obfuscation, the rhythmic drone of bureaucratic jargon, and the carefully curated appearances of political power. But in an instant, it had been transformed into a theater of clinical execution. Vice President J.D. Vance's voice, a gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate the very mahogany of the witness table, resonated with an almost predatory calm. It was not the voice of a man asking a question. It was the voice of a man delivering a sentence, a final judgment that left no room for appeal. Every head in the room, a sprawling sea of seasoned journalists with their pens poised like weapons, nervous congressional staffers clutching their tablets, and stony-faced senators who had seen it all, snapped towards the source of the interruption. The cameras, previously focused on the poised, almost regal figure of Ilhan Omar at the witness table, swiveled with a synchronized, mechanical whir that sounded like the cocking of a dozen rifles. Their lenses, like the multifaceted eyes of a collective digital beast, now fixed on the imposing silhouette of Vance as he strode through the grand, ornate double doors at the back of the chamber. The heavy oak doors, carved with symbols of a republic that felt suddenly fragile, groaned on their hinges as they swung shut behind him, sealing the room in a bubble of impending doom. This was not merely irregular. It was a profound, unprecedented breach of protocol that signaled a coming storm of historic proportions. Vice presidents did not attend committee hearings uninvited, and they certainly did not interrupt the testimony of a sitting congresswoman with accusations of treasonous financing. But there he stood, a man whose political ascent had been defined by a ruthless, almost surgical efficiency, walking down the center aisle with a deliberate, heavy tread that seemed to echo the ticking of a countdown clock. Flanking him were two figures whose presence added a chilling, undeniable weight to the moment. FBI Director Christopher Wray, his face a mask of stoic, unreadable resolve, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, whose very presence hinted at a paper trail that led from the gleaming towers of Washington to the darkest, most dangerous corners of international finance. They moved with the synchronized, grim purpose of a firing squad approaching its target. The sound of their footsteps on the plush, navy blue carpet, embroidered with the seal of the Senate, seemed to echo the rhythmic beating of a drum, a death knell for a career that had once seemed not just successful but untouchable. The air in the room, usually kept at a crisp 68 degrees, suddenly felt heavy and humid, thick with the scent of old paper, expensive cologne, and the metallic tang of fear. Omar froze. The meticulously prepared testimony she had been delivering, a passionate, emotionally charged plea for a massive increase in humanitarian aid to Somalia, died on her lips, leaving her mouth hanging open in a silent gasp. For 30 minutes, she had held the room captive, weaving a narrative of human suffering and moral obligation, of the plight of refugees fleeing violence and the enduring, shining promise of the American dream. The Democratic members of the committee, led by Senator Ben Cardin, had offered sympathetic, rhythmic nods, their faces mirrors of her own feigned concern, their eyes wet with performative empathy. The Republicans, looking bored but not overtly hostile, had seemed ready for the charade to end so they could move on to the next item on the agenda, perhaps a lunch meeting or a fundraiser. It had been going exactly as planned, a carefully orchestrated performance of political theater designed to bolster her brand and secure more funding for her family's interests, until the Vice President of the United States walked in. He carried a manila folder clutched in his large, calloused hand, its bright red, classified markings, a stark, ominous warning of the devastation contained within its covers. Committee Chairman Jim Risch, a veteran of decades of political skirmishes, high-stakes hearings, and backroom deals, looked as genuinely bewildered as the newest intern in the gallery. His mouth opened and closed for several seconds, his eyes darting between Vance and the witness table, before he could finally find his voice. "Mr. Vice President, this is highly irregular. We're in the middle of testimony from the representative, and we have a very tight schedule to maintain. This hearing was convened to discuss aid, not personal finances." Vance didn't even look at him. He didn't acknowledge the chair, didn't break his steady, relentless stride, and didn't offer even a cursory nod of greeting to the other senators. He walked directly to the witness table, his gaze fixed solely on Omar with a piercing intensity that seemed to strip away her defenses, layer by layer. He stood before her, a towering figure of executive authority, and placed the folder with a deliberate, heavy thud directly in front of her. The sound was deafening in the sudden, absolute silence that had gripped the room, a silence so profound that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. "I am aware of the schedule, Senator," Vance said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying to the furthest corners of the room without the need for the microphone. It was a voice honed on the campaign trail and in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley, a voice that brooked no argument. "But Representative, Omar is testifying about U.S. policy towards Somalia, about how much aid we should send, about which organizations should receive American taxpayer money. I think before the committee makes any decisions based on her expert testimony, they should know about her personal financial connections to designated terrorist organizations in Somalia. I think the American people, whose money she is so eager to spend, deserve to know who she is actually working for. This isn't just a matter of personal finance, Senator. It's a matter of national security." The room erupted. It was a visceral, chaotic sound, a cacophony of shouted questions from the press gallery, gasps of disbelief from the staffers, and the frantic, staccato clicking of camera shutters that sounded like a hail of bullets hitting the floor. Reporters surged forward, their faces a mixture of professional hunger and raw, unadulterated shock. Committee members, their previous decorum shattered like a dropped mirror, began talking over each other, a confused murmur rising to a roar of indignation and confusion. Omar's face, which moments ago had radiated the confident, almost arrogant defiance of a woman who believed herself beyond reproach, drained of all color in a matter of seconds. It became a canvas of stark, white terror, her skin appearing translucent and fragile under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the hearing room. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such violence she was certain the microphones would pick up the sound, a frantic, trapped bird beating its wings against a cage of its own making. Her hands, previously resting gracefully on the table, began to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable shaking that she tried to hide by clenching them into white-knuckled fists. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She had covered her tracks. She had used the Hawala networks. She had been careful, so very careful. She had been told that the encrypted messages were unbreakable, that the money trail was invisible. Vance, oblivious to the chaos he had unleashed, or perhaps merely indifferent to it, opened the folder with a slow, deliberate movement. He pulled out a stack of documents that looked painfully official, bank records with the seals of major international institutions, wire transfer confirmations with digital timestamps, and internal Treasury Department memos with top-secret headers, all bearing Omar's name in a font that seemed to scream her guilt to the world. 47 separate wire transfers, Vance announced, his voice a cold, rhythmic hammer blow that silenced the room once more, each word landing with the weight of a stone. Between January 2020 and October 2024, the total amount is $340,000. Every single cent of it was sent from Representative Omar's personal bank accounts, the same account she uses to receive her congressional salary. All of it was sent through money transfer services to a single recipient in Mogadishu. He paused, a master of the dramatic beat, letting the weight of the number sink in. $340,000. A fortune in a country where the average person lived on less than $1 a day. A fortune sent in secret by a woman who claimed to be a champion of the poor. A woman who spoke eloquently about the struggle of the common man while secretly enriching a terrorist network. The recipient, Vance continued, his eyes never leaving Omar's, which were now wide and glassy with a dawning realization of her own ruin, was Ahmed Nursey, your brother-in-law, A man whose name does not appear on a single one of your financial disclosure forms. A man who has been a phantom in your public narrative, but a central figure in your private life. He began to lay the documents on the table, fanning them out for the cameras with the practiced ease of a dealer showing a winning hand in a high-stakes game of poker. Each page was a damning piece of evidence, a physical manifestation of a secret life she had fought so hard to keep hidden. Omar's signature, her bank account numbers, the precise amounts, the dates of the transfers, all of it was laid bare for the world to see. The cameras zoomed in, their digital sensors capturing the ink of her betrayal in high definition. Ahmed Nursey, Vance said, his voice now a low, dangerous growl that seemed to emanate from his chest, operates a business in Mogadishu called Bakara Trading Company. In September of 2023, the United States Treasury Department officially designated Bakara Trading as a terrorism financing entity. Ahmed himself is on the FBI's Consolidated Terrorism Watch List, a man considered a direct threat to the national security of the United States. And the money you sent him, the $340,000 we have meticulously documented and verified, we've traced it through a complex, shadowy web of Hawala networks directly to al-Shabaab operatives, to the very terrorists you claim you fled from as a child, to the people who have spent decades tearing your homeland apart and murdering the very people you claim to represent. You weren't helping family, representative. You were helping a monster. Omar tried to speak, but her throat felt as though it had been filled with dry sand and broken glass. Her mouth was a parched desert, her tongue a heavy, useless weight. No sound emerged, only a pathetic, wet click that was amplified by the microphone in front of her. Her eyes stared at the documents as if they were venomous vipers, coiled and ready to strike at her heart. These were her records. These were the secrets she thought were buried forever in the digital ether of the international banking system. She could see the dates, the transfers made right after she had received her committee briefings, the money sent just days before major attacks in Mogadishu. They were family transfers, she finally managed to whisper, her voice a fragile, breaking thing that lacked any conviction. I was helping family members who were struggling. I didn't know. I had no idea about any of this. My brother-in-law, he has a business. I thought I was supporting a legitimate enterprise. You were helping family finance a terrorist insurgency, Vance countered, his voice flat and devoid of even a hint of mercy. You are a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. You receive classified briefings on the security situation in Somalia. You knew exactly who Ahmed Nursey was, and you knew exactly what he was doing with that money. You didn't just ignore the warnings, you actively bypassed the safeguards. Director Ray, if you would be so kind as to show the committee the fruits of your investigation. Let's see the map of this betrayal in all its ugly detail. FBI Director Christopher Wray stepped forward, a sleek black tablet in his hand that controlled the large, high-definition monitors mounted on the walls of the chamber. With a few precise, practiced swipes, he brought up a digital flowchart that was as beautiful in its complexity as it was horrifying in its implications. It was a map of blood and money, a web of connections that spanned continents and bypassed laws. The trail is undeniable, Senator, Ray stated, his voice clinical and professional, the voice of a man who dealt in the cold, hard currency of facts. It begins here, with Representative Omar's personal accounts in Minnesota. From there, the funds were moved through various money transfer services, often in amounts just below the $10,000 federal reporting threshold, a classic technique used by money launderers and terrorist financiers to avoid detection. The money was sent to Ahmed Nursey in Mogadishu. From Ahmed, the money was dispersed into a network of 18 primary facilitators. He tapped the screen, and the chart expanded, revealing a web of names, aliases, and faces. All 18 of these individuals are on our primary terrorism watch lists. 7 are confirmed, high-ranking members of al-Shabaab's leadership council, the men who plan the strategy of terror. 4 are financial facilitators who specialize in laundering money for the organization's global operations, moving funds through shell companies and front organizations. The remaining 7 provide the logistical support, the weapons, the explosives, the safe houses, and the transportation, that allow al-Shabaab to function as a lethal, effective force. The room was deathly silent now, the only sound the faint, mechanical hum of the air conditioning and the rapid, shallow breathing of the woman at the witness table. Ray pulled up a series of photographs, grainy surveillance images taken in the back alleys of Mogadishu, social media posts from extremist accounts, and classified intelligence files. Men in Mogadishu, some in military fatigues holding AK-47s, some in traditional dress, all of them labeled with their specific roles in a terrorist hierarchy. We can directly trace approximately $34,000 of the funds sent by Representative Omar to two specific, high-profile terrorist attacks, Ray continued, his voice never wavering, each word a hammer blow to her defense. The first was the Mogadishu hotel bombing on March 15, 2022. That attack killed 17 innocent people, including 2 American aid workers who were in the country to provide the very humanitarian assistance Representative Omar claims to champion. The second was the assault on African Union peacekeepers on August 23, 2023, which resulted in the deaths of 9 brave soldiers who were trying to bring stability to the region. Both attacks were funded by the money she sent. The images of the aftermath, the charred, skeletal remains of the hotel, the twisted, blackened wreckage of the peacekeepers' vehicles, the bodies covered in white sheets, filled the screens. The blood on the pavement seemed to cry out from the digital display, a silent accusation against the woman who had provided the means for the carnage. The money Representative Omar sent, Ray concluded, his voice a final, damning judgment, was the fuel for those fires. It bought the explosives. It paid the drivers of the suicide vehicles. It funded the planning and the intelligence gathering. This isn't a theory, Senator. This isn't a political attack. This is a forensic accounting of a massacre, and the trail leads directly to the woman sitting at that table. She didn't just fund them, she enabled them. Omar stood up abruptly, her chair screeching against the polished marble floor with a sound that made half the room flinch. Her chest was heaving, her hands trembling so violently she had to clench them into fists to keep from losing control entirely. "This is Islamophobia," she shrieked, her voice cracking under the unbearable strain of her own desperation. "This is the same targeted, racist harassment that Muslims in this country have faced for decades. You are attacking me because I am a Muslim woman, because I speak out against American imperialism, because I dare to criticize the status quo. You are manufacturing this evidence to silence a voice for the marginalized and the oppressed. You are using the tools of the state to crush a political opponent. This is evidence," Vance said, his voice a calm, immovable object against the storm of her rhetoric. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of the truth did the work for him. Bank records don't have a religion, Representative. Wire transfer confirmations don't have a political bias. You sent $340,000 to a man you knew was a designated terrorism financier. That is a violation of Title 18, Section 2339B of the United States Code. It is a federal crime that carries a penalty of up to 20 years in prison. It is a betrayal of the oath you took to protect and defend the Constitution. Your religion is not a shield for your crimes. He pulled out a copy of the statute, the legal language stark and unforgiving in the bright light. The law is quite clear. Providing material support or resources to a foreign terrorist organization is a felony. It does not matter if the recipient is your brother-in-law. It does not matter if you claim you were merely helping family. You had a duty to know, and given your position on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, you almost certainly did know. Ignorance is not a defense for a member of Congress. In fact, it's an admission of incompetence at best and complicity at worst. Vance then pulled out a final set of documents, her congressional voting records, printed on official House stationery. "Let's look at your actions as a legislator, Representative. In July of 2021, you were one of only 3 members of the House to vote against a resolution designating al-Shabaab as a foreign terrorist organization. In October of 2022, you voted against imposing sanctions on entities that finance terrorism in East Africa. And just today, you were here pushing for increased aid that we have discovered would have been funneled through NGOs that your own family members control. You were using your vote to protect your investment in terror. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a physical weight on her shoulders. Every vote you cast, every policy you championed, served the interests of the very people who were receiving your money. You weren't representing the people of Minnesota's 5th District. You were representing the interests of a terrorist network in Mogadishu. You didn't just fund them with your money, you protected them with your vote. You used the power of the American government to facilitate the destruction of American interests. You are a traitor to the people who elected you, and to the country that welcomed you. The Democratic members of the committee looked as if they were attending a funeral for their own credibility. Some stared at their laps, others at the ceiling, anywhere but at the woman they had once defended with such fervor. Senator Cardin looked as if he might be physically ill, his hand shaking as he reached for a glass of water. The Republicans, meanwhile, were practically vibrating with a grim, triumphant energy, their eyes gleaming with the knowledge that they had finally caught their quarry. The cameras, like vultures circling a dying animal, captured every agonizing second of Omar's collapse. The way her eyes darted around the room searching for an ally who wasn't there, the way her breath came in short, jagged gasps, the way her entire body seemed to be shrinking under the weight of the revelation. "I want my attorney," Omar finally gasped, her voice barely audible over the ringing in her ears. "You're going to need a team of them," Vance replied, his voice chillingly devoid of emotion, "because the FBI has more than just terrorism financing to discuss with you. Director Ray, perhaps you should inform the representative and the committee about the status of the investigation into her marriage fraud and the DNA evidence we have obtained. Let's talk about the man you claimed was your husband, but who the science says is your brother." The word marriage hit the room like a physical blow. The rumors had circulated for years, dismissed by her supporters as right-wing conspiracy theories, as racist attacks, as Islamophobic tropes. But now, with the vice president and the director of the FBI standing there with a folder full of evidence, the rumors were taking on the terrifying weight of official, undeniable reality. Omar felt the world tilt. The walls of the hearing room seemed to close in on her, the lights becoming blindingly bright, the faces of the senators blurring into a sea of judgment. This was the end. She could feel it in the marrow of her bones, a cold, creeping dread that no amount of rhetoric could ward off. The carefully constructed facade, the years of carefully curated public service, the speeches, the awards, the fame, it was all dissolving into a sea of ink, blood, and betrayal. 4 hours earlier, Ilhan Omar had stood in front of the ornate, gilded mirror in her congressional office, adjusting her vibrant hijab with a steady, confident hand. She had looked at her reflection and seen a woman at the absolute height of her powers. She was a global celebrity, a trailblazer, a voice for the voiceless, a woman who had defied the odds to become one of the most powerful people in Washington. She had been reviewing her testimony with her staff, a group of young, idealistic believers who saw her as a secular saint, a warrior for justice in a corrupt world. "The emotional beats are perfect, Congresswoman," her chief of staff, a young man named Marcus who had spent months crafting her narrative, had said. He was leaning against her heavy mahogany desk, a tablet in his hand, his eyes bright with excitement. "When you talk about the dust, the hunger, and the fear of the unknown in the refugee camp, it's going to kill on social media. We'll have clips of that trending before the hearing is even over. It's the perfect counter to the administration's rhetoric. We're going to frame this as a battle between compassion and cruelty. We'll make them look like monsters for even questioning the aid." Omar had nodded, a small, self-satisfied smile playing on her lips as she adjusted the microphone on her lapel. She had practiced the pause, the slight catch in her voice, the way she would look directly into the camera with a mixture of sadness and strength when she spoke about moral courage. She had felt invincible, a woman who had mastered the game of politics in a city built on deception. She had navigated the treacherous, shark-infested waters of Washington for 6 years, deflecting scandals that would have sunk a dozen other politicians with a wave of her hand and a cry of persecution. She had the unwavering support of the progressive base, the protection of the party leadership, and a media that was often more interested in her narrative than her actions. She had thought about the money she had sent. It was a risk, she knew, but she had convinced herself it was a necessary one. Ahmed was family. He was her connection to home, to the world she had left behind. He was doing important work, or so he said in their encrypted messages. He had told her the money was for security, for protection. She had chosen to believe him, or rather, she had chosen not to ask too many questions. And besides, who would ever find out? The Hawala networks were ancient, informal, and nearly impossible for Western intelligence agencies to penetrate, or so she believed. She was a member of Congress. She had friends in high places, friends who would protect her. She was part of the elite. She was protected by the very system she claimed to oppose. As she left her office, she had been flanked by her security detail and a phalanx of staffers, all of them moving with an air of self-importance. They had walked through the long, echoing tunnels that connected the House office buildings to the Capitol, their footsteps a rhythmic, confident beat on the cold stone. She had stopped to talk to a group of school children who were visiting the Capitol, her face a mask of practiced warmth as she spoke about the importance of representation and the power of the American dream. She had felt like a queen among her subjects, a woman who had reached the pinnacle of success. The drive to the Dirksen Senate office building had been short, but she had used the time to refine her talking points. She had visualized the senators' faces, the way she would deflect their questions, the way she would turn their attacks back on them. She had felt a surge of adrenaline, a hunger for the spotlight. This was her stage, and she was the lead actress. She had even joked with her communications director about which dress she would wear for the inevitable victory interview. The memory of that confidence now felt like a bitter, cruel joke. As she sat at the witness table, the smell of the mahogany and the faint, antiseptic scent of floor wax suddenly became nauseating, cloying and thick in her throat. She could see the reporters in the front row, their pens flying across their notebooks like scythes, their thumbs blurring over their phones as they sent out the news of her downfall to a waiting world. She was no longer the hero of the story. She was the villain, and the world was watching her execution. Vance watched her, his expression unreadable, his eyes like flint. He had spent 18 long months preparing for this moment, working in the shadows with a small, trusted team of investigators from the FBI, the Treasury, and the NSA. He had seen the wiretap transcripts, the bank records, and the surveillance footage. He had seen the photos of her meeting with Ahmed's associates in third countries. He knew the true extent of her betrayal, and he knew that today was the day it would all come to an end. He knew the immense political risks of such a public confrontation, but he also knew the absolute necessity of it. This wasn't just about one corrupt politician. It was about the integrity of the American system itself. It was about showing that no one, no matter how powerful their narrative, how loud their supporters, or how many awards they had won, was above the law. "Director Ray," Vance said, his voice breaking the heavy silence that had fallen over the room once more. "I believe you have a warrant to execute. Let's bring this charade to a close and let justice take its course." Ray stepped forward, his voice formal, solemn, and utterly final. Ilhan Omar, based on evidence gathered during an 18-month multi-agency investigation, a federal grand jury has returned an indictment against you on charges of material support for terrorism, immigration fraud, tax evasion, and multiple campaign finance violations. There are FBI agents waiting just outside these doors. When you leave this room, you will be taken into federal custody. The room went white, not from a flash but from the sheer collective shock of the moment. You couldn't arrest a sitting member of Congress in the middle of a hearing. It was unprecedented. It was impossible. It was the kind of thing that happened in other countries, in the very regimes Omar so often criticized, not in the United States. "You can't do this," Omar screamed, her voice reaching a pitch of pure, unadulterated hysteria that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "I have immunity. This is a legislative proceeding. You are violating the Constitution. This is a political hit job. You are trying to silence the voice of the people. The Constitution protects you from arrest for minor offenses while Congress is in session, Representative," Ray said, his voice as cold and unforgiving as a winter morning in Minnesota. "It does not protect you from felony charges related to terrorism and fraud. You are not above the law. Not today. Not ever. The law is not a suggestion. It is a command, and you have broken it repeatedly." Omar tried to stand, but her legs were like water, her muscles refusing to obey her commands. She stumbled, her hands catching the edge of the mahogany table to keep from falling. Her staff, previously so confident and arrogant, were now huddled together in the corner of the room, their faces masks of terror and confusion. Some were already on their phones, likely calling lawyers, deleting files, or trying to find a way to distance themselves from the woman who was now a pariah. They were already calculating how to survive the fallout. Vance turned to Chairman Risch, his face a mask of professional courtesy. "Mr. Chairman, I believe this concludes the relevant portion of my appearance today. I will leave the evidence, the bank records, the intercepts, and the DNA reports with the committee for your review. I trust you will act accordingly and fulfill your duty to the Senate and the country." Risch, still looking like he had been struck by lightning, merely nodded, his gavel resting limply in his hand. This hearing is adjourned," he managed to say, his voice weak and hollow. The gavel fell with a dull thud that seemed to signal the end of an era, the end of a career, and the end of a long, dark deception. Omar was already moving, or trying to. She pushed past the bailiffs, her eyes wild and unfocused, her hijab slightly askew. She ran for the doors, a desperate primal need to escape the room, to escape the cameras, to escape the truth that was now chasing her like a pack of wolves. She burst through the double doors into the grand, marble-floored hallway of the Dirksen Senate office building, her heels clicking frantically on the stone. But the escape she sought wasn't there. Waiting for her in the hallway were 6 FBI agents in dark suits, their badges gleaming under the bright overhead lights. They moved with a quiet, terrifying efficiency that spoke of years of training. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. They simply formed a circle around her, cutting off every path of retreat, their faces grim and professional. "Ilhan Abdullahi Omar," the lead agent said, his voice calm, professional, and utterly immovable. "You are under arrest. Please put your hands behind your back." "No, get away from me. You have no right," Omar shrieked, her voice echoing off the marble walls and drawing the attention of everyone in the hallway. She tried to pull away, to push through them, but they were like stone pillars. The cameras from the hearing room had followed her out, the reporters and photographers spilling into the hallway like a flood of hungry ghosts. They captured every second of the struggle, the way her face contorted in a mixture of rage and fear, the way her hands were forced behind her back, the way the steel handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the entire building. It was the sound of a career ending. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent began, the familiar, rhythmic words of the Miranda warning sounding like a funeral rite for her career. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights? This is a coup. This is a dark day for democracy," Omar shouted at the cameras, her voice raw and desperate. "This is political persecution. They are arresting me because I am a threat to their power, because I speak the truth. Don't let them do this." But the cameras didn't care about her rhetoric anymore. They were focused on the handcuffs. They were focused on the way she was being led toward the elevators, her head bowed, her once proud silhouette now small and defeated. The senators watched from the doorway of the hearing room, a silent, somber audience to the fall of one of their own, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, relief, and a deep, unsettling sense of history being made. They knew that the world would never be the same after today. Within minutes, the footage was everywhere. It wasn't just on the news, it was the news. The image of Ilhan Omar in handcuffs, being led away by federal agents in the heart of the nation's capital, became the defining image of the decade. It was the lead story on every network, the headline on every website from London to Tokyo, the topic of every conversation in every coffee shop and boardroom in America. It was a moment of national reckoning. By that evening, the House of Representatives had already begun the process of expulsion. The evidence presented by Vance and Ray was so overwhelming, so undeniable, that even her most ardent, long-time supporters found themselves unable to defend her. The political calculation had shifted in an instant, a brutal, unforgiving realignment. To stand with Omar was now to stand with terrorism, and in Washington, That was a death sentence for any political career. The following day, the House met in an emergency session that felt more like a sentencing than a debate. The atmosphere was somber, the usual partisan bickering replaced by a heavy, oppressive sense of historical consequence. The vote for expulsion required a two-thirds majority, a high bar that had only been cleared a handful of times in the long history of the American Republic. The final tally was 376 to 54. Only a small group of the most radical progressive members, those who had hitched their entire political identity and career to her brand, voted against it. Everyone else, Republicans and Democrats alike, voted to remove her. She was expelled from the House of Representatives, the third fastest expulsion in the history of the Republic. She was no longer a congresswoman. She was no longer a leader. She was a federal inmate waiting for her day in court. She had gone from the heights of power to the depths of disgrace in less than 24 hours. The criminal trial, which began in February of 2025, was a media circus of unprecedented, almost grotesque proportions. The courthouse in Washington, D.C. was surrounded by protesters, journalists, and curious onlookers who had traveled from across the country to witness the spectacle. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution laid out a case that was as meticulous as it was devastating, a masterpiece of forensic investigation that left no stone unturned. They presented the wire transfers, the bank records, and the NSA intercepts of her brother-in-law. They brought in world-renowned experts to explain the ancient Hawala networks and the brutal structure of al-Shabaab. They showed the jury the high-resolution photographs of the victims of the bombings her money had funded, the innocent aid workers, the peacekeepers, the Somali civilians whose lives had been cut short by her ambition and greed. One witness, a former FBI agent who had spent years undercover in East Africa, testified about the specific ways the money had been used. The funds provided by Representative Omar weren't just for food or medicine, he said, his voice steady and calm, his eyes fixed on the jury. They were used to purchase the very components that make up an IED. They were used to pay the salaries of the men who pull the triggers. They were used to fund the propaganda that radicalizes young people and turns them into suicide bombers. This money was the lifeblood of a terrorist organization, and she was the one who provided the transfusion. Another witness, a Treasury official with decades of experience in tracking illicit finance, explained the complex money laundering schemes Omar had used. She was sophisticated, more sophisticated than most people realize, he said. She used multiple accounts, multiple money transfer services, and she always kept the amounts just below the $10,000 reporting threshold. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a series of oversights. This was a deliberate, calculated attempt to hide her actions from the very government she was a part of. She was playing a double game. But the most damning, most undeniable evidence was the DNA. The prosecution presented the results of a court-ordered DNA test that proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the man Ilhan Omar had married in 2009, Ahmed Nursaid Elmi, was her biological brother. The marriage had been a sham, a calculated piece of immigration fraud designed to circumvent the laws of the country she had sworn to serve. It was a lie that had been the foundation of her political career, and now it was the instrument of her destruction. The science was cold, hard, and irrefutable. Omar's defense team tried everything in their power. They claimed the evidence was manufactured by a deep state conspiracy. They claimed she was a victim of a sophisticated, global disinformation campaign orchestrated by her enemies. They tried to put the entire history of American foreign policy on trial to make the case about everything except her actions. But the jury wasn't interested in her narrative or her excuses. They were interested in the facts, and the facts were overwhelming. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict that everyone in the room already knew was coming: guilty on all counts. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, the only sound the faint scratching of pens and the muffled sobs of a few remaining supporters in the gallery. The sentencing hearing was equally dramatic, a final, public accounting of her crimes. The judge, a man known for his fairness and his lack of patience for political grandstanding, didn't hold back. "You were given a gift, Representative Omar," he said, his voice echoing in the silent, packed courtroom. "You were a refugee who was welcomed by this country, who was given every opportunity to succeed. You rose to one of the highest offices in the land, and you used that power to betray the very people who trusted you. You funded the murder of innocents. You lied to the government. You made a mockery of our laws. You are a disgrace to the office you held and to the people you represented. You have forfeited your right to be a part of this society." He sentenced her to 15 years in federal prison, to be followed by immediate deportation upon the completion of her sentence. It was a sentence that ensured she would never again set foot in the halls of power, and that she would eventually be sent back to the very place she had betrayed. Omar's life in prison was a far cry from the luxury, influence, and adulation she had once known. She was sent to a maximum security facility in West Virginia, a place of gray concrete and cold steel where she was just another number in a sea of forgotten faces. Her fame, which had once been her greatest asset, was now her greatest liability, a target on her back that she could never remove. The other inmates knew exactly who she was. They had seen the news. They knew she had been a congresswoman, and they knew she had been convicted of funding terrorism. In the brutal hierarchy of prison life, she was at the very bottom. She was attacked twice in her first month, once in the crowded cafeteria and once in the laundry room. Both attacks were carried out by women who had lost family members in the military, women who saw her as a traitor to the country that had given her everything. They didn't care about her politics. They cared about her betrayal. For her own safety, she was moved to protective custody, a euphemism for solitary confinement. She spent 23 hours a day in a small, windowless cell, her only contact with the outside world through a small slit in the steel door. The silence was absolute and oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic clanging of the guards' keys and the distant, muffled shouts of other inmates. It was a world of gray walls and endless time. She spent her days reading and writing long, rambling letters that were rarely answered. She wrote to her children, to her former colleagues, to the media, always portraying herself as the victim, always looking for a way out. But the world had moved on. Her children, horrified by the revelations and the deep shame she had brought upon their family, distanced themselves. Her eldest daughter, who had once been her most vocal and public supporter, sent her a final, devastating letter that broke whatever remained of her spirit. "I've changed my name," the letter read, the words written in a sharp, angry hand. "I don't want to be associated with you anymore. You didn't just betray the country, you betrayed us. You used us as props in your story while you were doing things that would make us sick. Don't write back. I'm starting a new life, one where the name Omar doesn't exist, where your shadow can't reach me. I want to forget you ever existed." Omar read that letter until the ink began to fade from her tears. But even in the depths of her isolation, she couldn't bring herself to admit she had done anything wrong. In her mind, she was still the victim, a martyr for a cause that only she truly understood. She convinced herself that history would vindicate her, that one day people would see her as a hero who had been silenced by a corrupt, racist system. She lived in a world of her own making, a world of delusions and lies. But the world outside had moved on, and it was a world that was fundamentally changed by her actions. The Omar effect had a profound, lasting impact on American politics. It led to a massive overhaul of the vetting process for political candidates and a renewed, intense focus on the financial disclosures of every member of Congress. It made it much harder for other Muslim candidates, many of whom were honest, hardworking people, to get elected. They were forced to answer for her crimes, to prove they weren't like her, to distance themselves from a woman they had never even met. She had poisoned the well for an entire generation. The progressive movement, which had once seen her as its brightest, most promising star, was forced to undergo a painful, public period of soul-searching. They had to reckon with the fact that they had ignored the warning signs, that they had prioritized narrative over truth, and that they had allowed a corrupt individual to become the face of their movement. They had to learn the hard lesson that identity is not a substitute for integrity. As the years passed, Omar became a footnote in history, a cautionary tale told to young politicians about the dangers of hubris and the inevitability of the truth. Her name became synonymous with betrayal and corruption, a name that was spoken in hushed tones or with a shake of the head. In 2040, after serving 15 long years of her sentence, Ilhan Omar was released from federal prison. She was 58 years old, her hair gray, her face lined with the bitterness and isolation of her confinement. She was met at the prison gates not by her family or her supporters, but by ICE agents who immediately took her into custody for deportation. She was flown back to Somalia, a country she hadn't seen in nearly 40 years. She landed in Mogadishu on a hot, dusty afternoon, the smell of the sea and the charcoal smoke a distant, painful memory of a childhood she had long since betrayed. She was no longer a congresswoman. She was no longer a celebrity. She was a deported felon with no money, no family, and no future. She was a stranger in her own land. She lived out the rest of her days in a small, one-room apartment in a crumbling building on the outskirts of the city. She survived on odd jobs, cleaning and cooking for people who didn't know who she was and wouldn't have cared if they did. She was a ghost in her own homeland, a woman who had betrayed two countries and was now welcomed by neither. She was a woman with no place to call home. She would walk through the streets of Mogadishu, her face covered by a simple veil, her eyes always downcast. She saw the destruction, the poverty, and the despair that her money had helped to perpetuate. She saw the children with no future, the families torn apart by violence, and the sense of hopelessness that hung over the city like a shroud. She knew that she had played a part in this, that her choices had had real, devastating consequences for millions of people. She was surrounded by the evidence of her own betrayal. Sometimes she would sit on the small, rusted balcony of her apartment and watch the sunset over the Indian Ocean. She would think about the hearing room, about the cameras, and about the look on J.D. Vance's face when he handed her that folder. She would think about the life she could have had if she had just been honest. She would think about her children, about the people she had hurt, and about the country she had betrayed. But mostly, she just sat in the silence, a forgotten woman in a forgotten corner of the world, waiting for the end. She died at the age of 62, alone in her apartment. Her body wasn't found for 3 days, until the neighbors complained about the smell. There was no funeral, no memorial service, and no obituary in the American papers she had once dominated. The only record of her passing was a small, 3-paragraph notice in a local Mogadishu newspaper, identifying her as a former American politician who had died of natural causes. It was a lonely, quiet end for a woman who had once been the center of the world's attention. It was a quiet, unremarkable end for a woman whose life had been defined by noise, controversy, and betrayal. She had been given everything, fame, power, influence, and she had thrown it all away. Not because of persecution, not because of prejudice, but because of her own choices. She had chosen the path of betrayal, and in the end, it was the only path she had left. She was a victim of her own ambition. If you found this narrative of power, betrayal, and the ultimate fall from grace compelling, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and turning on notifications. We are dedicated to bringing you the most in-depth, dramatic explorations of the political dramas that shape our world. Your support allows us to continue our work of uncovering the stories that the powerful would rather keep hidden. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next deep dive. The hours following her arrest were a blur of cold, fluorescent-lit rooms and the rhythmic, mechanical questioning of federal agents. Omar sat in a small, windowless interrogation room at the FBI's Washington field office, the weight of the handcuffs still feeling like a phantom presence on her wrists. The air in the room was stale, smelling of industrial cleaner and old coffee. Across from her sat 2 agents, their faces as unreadable as the gray walls. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. They simply presented document after document, each one a fresh layer of her ruin. Let's talk about the Hawala transfers again, Ilhan, the lead agent, a man named Henderson with eyes like flint, said. He pushed a photograph across the table, a grainy image of a man she recognized all too well. This is Ahmed Nursey. We know you've been communicating with him through encrypted channels. We have the logs. We know you weren't just sending money, you were receiving instructions. You were being told which policies to support, which sanctions to oppose. You weren't just a donor, you were an asset. Omar stared at the photo, her mind racing. She tried to maintain her mask of defiance, but it was crumbling. I told you he's family. I was helping him with his business. I didn't know anything about Al-Shabaab. You're twisting the facts to fit your narrative." "We're not twisting anything," Henderson replied, his voice flat and clinical. "We have the NSA intercepts. We have the bank records from 3 different countries. We have the testimony of people who worked for Ahmed. They all say the same thing. The money came from you and it went to the terrorists. And they say you knew exactly where it was going. You weren't a victim of circumstance. You were a willing participant in a conspiracy to fund the murder of Americans." Outside the interrogation room, the world was in a state of absolute, chaotic upheaval. The footage of her arrest had gone viral within seconds, sparking a firestorm on social media that was unlike anything the country had ever seen. On Twitter, the hashtags Omar arrested and Somalia scandal were trending globally, with millions of people weighing in on the news. Her supporters were in a state of shock and denial, many of them claiming that the footage was a deepfake or a right-wing hit job. But as the official statements from the FBI and the Department of Justice began to roll in, the denial began to turn into a desperate, frantic attempt at damage control. On cable news, the talking heads were in a frenzy. On Fox News, the anchors were practically gloating, their faces alight with a grim satisfaction as they replayed the footage of her in handcuffs over and over again. "We told you so," they seemed to be saying. "We warned you about her, and you didn't listen." On CNN and MSNBC, the tone was more somber, a mixture of shock and a desperate attempt to find some way to frame the story that didn't implicate the entire progressive movement. They interviewed experts on terrorism and legal analysts who debated the strength of the evidence, but the underlying sense of horror was undeniable. In Minneapolis, the streets of her district were a sea of confusion and anger. Protests broke out almost immediately, with some people calling for her release and others calling for her head. The Somali American community, the very people she claimed to represent, was deeply divided. Many were horrified by the allegations, feeling that she had betrayed their trust and made them all look like suspects. Others felt that she was being targeted because of her success, that this was just another example of the system trying to crush a powerful Muslim woman. The tension in the city was palpable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Back in the interrogation room, the questioning continued late into the night. The agents didn't let up, their questions becoming more specific, more pointed. They asked about her marriage, about her tax returns, about her campaign finances. They showed her the DNA reports, the evidence of her fraud, the trail of lies that led back to her very first run for office. They were stripping her life down to its bare, ugly bones, and she had no way to stop them. "You're finished, Ilhan," Henderson said, his voice a final, quiet judgment. "The evidence is overwhelming. Your career is over. Your reputation is gone. The only thing left to decide is how many years you're going to spend in a federal cell. You can make it easier on yourself if you start telling the truth. Tell us about the others. Tell us who else was involved. Tell us about the network." But Omar remained silent, her jaw set in a hard line, her eyes fixed on the gray wall. She was still convinced that she could win, that her base would save her, that the narrative would eventually turn in her favor. She didn't realize that the narrative was already gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the law. She was a woman alone, a ghost in the machine of justice. The following weeks were a blur of legal maneuvers and public outcries. Her defense team, a group of high-priced lawyers who specialized in crisis management, tried every trick in the book to get the charges dropped or delayed. They filed motions, they gave interviews, they leaked documents to friendly reporters. They tried to frame the case as a First Amendment issue, a religious freedom issue, a human rights issue. But the evidence was too strong, the public outcry too loud. The wheels of justice were turning, and they were turning directly over her. The trial itself was a masterpiece of legal drama. The prosecution's opening statement was a devastating, hour-long narrative of betrayal and greed. They painted a picture of a woman who had used her position of trust to enrich herself and her family at the expense of the country she had sworn to serve. They showed the jury the flowchart of the money, the photos of the victims, the transcripts of the intercepts. They made the case personal, focusing on the American aid workers who had been killed by the very bombs her money had funded. The defense's opening statement was a desperate attempt to change the subject. They spoke about her inspiring story, her commitment to justice, her role as a trailblazer. They tried to make the case about prejudice and Islamophobia, but the judge repeatedly shut them down, reminding them that the case was about the evidence, not the politics. The jury, a diverse group of Washington, D.C. residents, watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. As the trial progressed, the evidence only became more damning. Witness after witness took the stand, each one adding another piece to the puzzle of her guilt. There was the bank official who testified about the unusual activity in her accounts. There was the FBI technician who explained how they had decrypted her messages. There was the Somali refugee who had seen her associates in Mogadishu and had been brave enough to testify against them. Each testimony was a nail in the coffin of her defense. The climax of the trial came when Omar herself took the stand. It was a calculated risk, a desperate attempt to win over the jury with her personal narrative. She spoke about her childhood, her struggles, her passion for her people. She tried to sound like the woman the world had once admired, the moral voice of a generation. But under cross-examination, the mask slipped. The prosecutor, a relentless man named Miller, didn't let her get away with her talking points. He pinned her down on the specifics, the dates, the amounts, the lies. He showed the jury the contradictions in her testimony, the gaps in her memory, the sheer arrogance of her defenses. By the time she left the stand, she was a broken woman, her credibility shattered beyond repair. The jury's verdict was a final, undeniable judgment, guilty on all counts. The word rang through the courtroom like a bell, a sound of finality and justice. Omar sat motionless, her face a mask of shock, as the judge thanked the jury and set a date for sentencing. She was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, a convicted felon, her journey from refugee to congresswoman to criminal complete. The sentencing hearing was a somber affair, a final public accounting of her crimes. The judge, his voice heavy with the weight of his responsibility, spoke for nearly an hour before delivering the sentence. He spoke about the sacred trust of public office, the heinous nature of terrorism financing, and the profound betrayal of her actions. He spoke about the victims, the families who had been torn apart, and the country that had been harmed. And then he delivered the sentence. 15 years in federal prison, followed by deportation. The years that followed were a long, slow descent into obscurity and despair. In prison, Omar was a woman without a country, a woman without a cause, a woman without a future. She spent her days in the quiet, sterile environment of protective custody, her only company the books she read and the letters she wrote. She watched the world change through the small television in the common room, seeing the rise and fall of other politicians, the shifting tides of public opinion, the slow, steady march of history. She saw herself being forgotten, her name becoming a footnote, her story becoming a cautionary tale. She wrote a memoir in prison, a long, self-serving document that she hoped would set the record straight. But no publisher would touch it. No one wanted to hear her side of the story anymore. The world had moved on, and it had moved on without her. She was a ghost, a relic of a time that people wanted to forget. By the time she was released and deported, she was a shadow of her former self. The woman who had once stood on the floor of the House of Representatives and lectured the world was gone, replaced by a frail, gray-haired woman who could barely walk. She landed in Mogadishu with nothing but a small suitcase and a sense of profound, soul-crushing regret. She lived out her final years in that one-room apartment, a woman who had betrayed everything and everyone she had ever known. And in the end, she died as she had lived for the last 15 years, alone, forgotten, and unmourned. It was the ultimate price for the ultimate betrayal. The media coverage of the trial was a relentless, 24-hour spectacle that consumed the national consciousness. Every major news network had a dedicated Omar trial desk, with graphics that featured her face superimposed over a map of Somalia and the word betrayal in bold, blood-red letters. The morning shows were filled with legal analysts who dissected every word of the testimony, every facial expression of the defendant, and every piece of evidence presented by the prosecution. They debated her intent, her state of mind, and the implications for the future of the Democratic Party. On social media, the trial was a battlefield of competing narratives. Her supporters, though dwindling in number, were fiercely vocal. using hashtags like Free Ilhan and political persecution to claim that she was a victim of a coordinated deep state conspiracy. They posted clips of her past speeches, trying to remind the world of the woman they had once admired, but their voices were increasingly drowned out by a wave of public indignation. The hashtag #OmarGuilty began to trend every time a new piece of evidence was revealed, with users sharing photos of the victims and demanding justice. The internet, which had once been her greatest tool for building her brand, was now the instrument of her public shamming. A high-profile documentary crew was even granted limited access to the courtroom, filming what would eventually become a multi-part series titled The Fall of the House of Omar. The series, which premiered shortly after her sentencing, featured interviews with former staffers who spoke anonymously about the culture of secrecy in her office, with neighbors in Minneapolis who felt betrayed by her actions, and with experts who traced her rise and fall with clinical precision. It became a cultural phenomenon, a cautionary tale for a new generation of activists and politicians. The political aftermath for her colleagues was equally devastating. The Omar effect wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was a career-ending reality for many who had stood by her. The other members of the squad, her closest allies in Congress, were forced into a state of permanent damage control. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who had once been her inseparable partner in political combat, was forced to undergo a series of grueling interviews where she was asked, over and over again, how she could have missed the signs. She eventually issued a long, carefully worded statement that expressed deep disappointment and a commitment to accountability, but the damage was done. The bond between them, once a symbol of progressive unity, was now a liability that threatened to sink them all. Other members of the squad faced their own investigations. The House Ethics Committee, energized by the Omar scandal, began a series of inquiries into the campaign finances and foreign connections of several other progressive members. While none were found to have committed crimes on the scale of Omar, the constant cloud of suspicion was enough to derail their legislative agendas and make them toxic to many of their former donors. The progressive movement, which had once seemed on the verge of taking over the party, was now in a state of retreat, its leaders tainted by their association with a convicted terrorist financier. The Democratic Party leadership, meanwhile, moved quickly to purge any remaining influence of the Omar faction. They restructured the Foreign Affairs Committee, implemented new, more stringent vetting procedures for candidates, and distanced themselves from the radical rhetoric that had once been so prominent. They were determined to show the American people that they were the party of law and order, not the party of betrayal. The political landscape of Washington was fundamentally altered, the scars of the Omar scandal visible in every new policy and every new election. In the final years of her life in Mogadishu, Omar became a figure of strange, tragic curiosity for the few people who knew who she was. She would occasionally be recognized by a passing journalist or a humanitarian worker, a ghost of a former self wandering through the dusty streets. They would try to interview her, to get some final word of remorse or some hidden truth, but she always refused. She had retreated into a world of her own making, a world where she was still the hero of her own story, a martyr who had been silenced by a world that didn't deserve her. She spent her days in a small, quiet routine. She would wake up early, before the heat of the day became unbearable, and walk to the local market to buy a few simple items, a handful of dates, a piece of bread, a small container of milk. She would return to her apartment and spend the morning reading the few books she had managed to bring with her, mostly histories and political biographies. In the afternoons, she would sit on her balcony and watch the city move below her, the sounds of the traffic and the voices of the people a constant, distant hum. She was a woman who had once commanded the attention of millions, now living a life of absolute, profound silence. Her death, when it finally came, was as quiet as her life had become. The heart attack that claimed her was sudden, a final, quick end to a long, slow decline. She died in her sleep, her hand resting on a worn, faded photograph of her children, the children who had long since disowned her. She was found 3 days later by the landlord, who had come to collect the rent. He didn't know who she was, only that she was a quiet woman who kept to herself. The three-paragraph notice in the Mogadishu paper was the only public acknowledgement of her passing. It didn't mention her fame, her power, or her crimes. It only mentioned her name, her age, and the fact that she had once been a politician in America. It was a final, ironic mercy for a woman who had spent her life chasing the spotlight, only to find herself dying in the shadows. The world she had betrayed had moved on, and in the end, it had forgotten her entirely. It was the ultimate consequence for a life built on lies and betrayal. That was the legacy of Ilhan Omar, a story that began with a dream and ended with a whisper in the dust of a city she had once claimed to love, but had ultimately helped to destroy. If you found this final chapter of her story as haunting as we did, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more in-depth explorations of the shadows of power. Thank you for being part of our journey into the heart of the world's most dramatic political narratives. Minneapolis, the city that had once been the base of her power, the aftermath of the scandal was a long, painful process of healing and reconstruction. The 5th District, which had once been a stronghold of progressive energy, was now a community divided and scarred by the betrayal. The Somali American community, in particular, felt the weight of the scandal most acutely. They had seen her as their champion, their voice in the halls of power, and her fall had left them feeling exposed and vulnerable. A series of community forums were held, where people spoke openly about their feelings of hurt, anger, and betrayal. They worked to rebuild their reputation, to show the rest of the country that they were not defined by the actions of one individual. They established new organizations, led by a new generation of leaders who prioritized transparency and integrity above all else. The legal reforms that followed the Omar scandal were some of the most significant in the history of the American political system. The Omar Act, as it came to be known, was a comprehensive piece of legislation that overhauled the way political candidates were vetted and the way their financial disclosures were monitored. It required more detailed reporting of foreign connections, more stringent background checks for those seeking high-level committee assignments, and more robust oversight of campaign funds. It was a bipartisan effort, a rare moment of unity in a divided Washington, born out of a shared realization that the system had failed and that it needed to be fixed. The act was signed into law by the president in a somber ceremony in the Rose Garden, a final, public acknowledgement of the damage that had been done and the steps that were being taken to prevent it from ever happening again. The memory of Ilhan Omar continued to linger in the halls of the Capitol, a ghost that haunted the dreams of young politicians and seasoned veterans alike. Her portrait, which had once hung proudly in the halls of the House, was removed and placed in storage, a symbol of a time that people wanted to forget. But her story remained, a powerful and tragic reminder of the dangers of hubris, the corrupting influence of power, and the absolute necessity of the truth. It was a story that would be told for generations, a cautionary tale for anyone who believed that they were above the law or that their narrative was more important than their actions. And in the end, that was the only thing that remained of the woman who had once been the center of the world's attention, a story, a warning, and a final, quiet whisper in the dust of history. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into one of the most consequential political dramas of our time. Your support makes this work possible, and we look forward to bringing you more stories from the heart of power and betrayal. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for our next investigation. Until then, stay vigilant.